Okay, still history from the 20th century. I think I'd like to say at least that this has got a happy ending, I guess. I mean, I feel so dreary to talk about this. When World War II ended, the Korean War struck up and continued. And I say 1948, I might be off by 3 years, I don't know. And it goes up to who knows when. I mean, it hasn't gone away. There was never a peace treaty signed on that. And then the Cold War began. Now the great enemies in the world were the Soviet Union and what was called the free world. You talked about the Iron Curtain. It was an ideological difference between two economic systems, really, communism and capitalism. And you know, my students nowadays, last time I had students, they often didn't really know anything about communism. I couldn't even have them come up with the word, which just I found staggering. Because for most of my life, that was the huge great enemy, the communist bloc of nations versus, we like to call ourselves the free world. And I'm not a history teacher, so I'm not going to go into it very much more. But I had said Karl Marx, back in the late Victorian era. If you want to understand the 20th century, there the groundwork was laid with Marx and Lenin and their philosophies about communism. Also, I'm not so sure if I explained about Nietzsche and his fascism, the system that he described, which would have one political party that ruled largely through fear. But anyway, that's backing up. Anyway, the Cold War, it was called cold because it didn't break out into outright fighting. If it had, we might not be here. The world had come to the brink of annihilation. And this should sound very scary to those that have never heard this. With the atomic weapons that were developed, and the Soviet Union got them too. And they became nuclear weapons. And in the 1950s, well, I heard one man say that a nuclear bomb, compared to a nuclear bomb, an atomic bomb was like a firecracker. It was 100 times more powerful. I think they tested it on Bikini Island, atoll in the Pacific. They tested it, and it was gone. When they went back, the atoll was gone. And since both sides had enough to basically wipe each other out, this Cold War was a period of just all the time in the background. There was this idea that if the right two buttons or the wrong two buttons were pushed, the world as we knew it would end, at least for humans. Possibly life on Earth, but probably not life on Earth, but human life, possibly. The worst of that Cold War, or the most precise moment of terror, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was around 1960 or 59 or 61, where the Soviet Union tried to put nuclear weapons on Cuba, and they were confronted on the high seas, and somebody had to back down. That was like a showdown. When you get into the 1960s, and the Cold War was still going on, but against that background, the war in Vietnam develops, and still fear of communists versus the free world. There was a doctrine called the Domino Theory, that if Vietnam would fall, then the other countries would fall. There was such a fear and dread this whole time. It began slowly, around 1964, maybe more. Finally ended in 1972. And it's shocking to Americans to hear this, but I would say it. America lost that war. The United States lost that war. It had been almost unthinkable that the United States could ever lose a war. But the United States lost that war. And it dealt a devastating blow to the United States. In a sense, the U.S. psyche was never quite the same. It divided the country so much. And in retrospect, I think so many Americans look back and say the United States was wrong. It was wrong to do that. These are harsh words. Maybe I'm going to get some nasty comments on the basis of this, but this is uncomfortable, very uncomfortable material for me to talk about because I lived this now. But then, if there's anything like a happy ending, I couldn't believe that I would ever live long enough to see this happen. But by the late 1980s, détente had developed, and that's a French word for a warming up of relationships. Glasnost was a policy in Russia where free speech was allowed. And eventually the German reunification, there had been a wall built in Berlin to separate it into and it was called the Iron Curtain that went through the world. The wall was torn down. Germany was reunited. I could hardly believe it was happening, because it was like the Cold War went away. And I think that's safe to say. We live in a different time now. And this year I'm not going to try really to talk too much about the last 20 years or so, because it's too close, it's too hard to say. So anyway, a kind of a happy ending there. Maybe as I think about this tomorrow, I'll have happier things to say about the 20th century, but it has been a time of war, I think. All right, we'll see you tomorrow.